So good afternoon. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mrs. Chambers. Can we turn then to the calendar square stroke Falkirk bug, bug number 2? In very simple terms, an explanation of the bug could be as follows. Would you agree with it? Firstly, it was a bug that afflicted Legacy Horizon.
Yes.
It started in about 2000.
Yes.
And it was caused by a lock in the Riposte software.
Yes.
You give a helpful explanation in slightly more detail in your witness statement, which I'd ask to be turned up, in paragraph 73 and 74, which are on pages 23 and 24. In 73, you say, within the SSC, we refer to the underlying problem as the Riposte lock problem. That's instead of the calendar square or Falkirk bug.
Yes.
Normally, Riposte messages were automatically replicated between counters, so each counter held an identical set of all transactions and reference data, of all transaction and reference data relating to that branch. But occasionally, one counter would fail to accept any messages from other counters. This usually seemed to be triggered by something early in the declaration or balancing process. Repeated application events were generated which were not visible to the user. The event storm and failure to replicate, just stopping there, what do you mean by the event storm?
The repeated application events, every few seconds the same event was generated, and we referred to that as a storm.
Would persist until the counter was rebooted or clear desk was run. What was clear desk?
That was the process that ran at some point in the early hours of the morning to restart the counter application.
Thank you. And then over the page to 74, the counter would still be able to serve customers and would appear to be working normally, but anything done on other counters after the event started would not be visible. Reports printed on the counter would not include transactions done on other counters, so those transactions might be re-entered. Incorrect discrepancies could be reported if the money was in the till, but the transactions weren't included in the balance. Transfers between stock units might be accepted in twice, causing a discrepancy and a receipts and payments mismatch. Single counter branches could not have this problem. And that can come down, thank you. The issues that I would like to address or explore with you, so you know where we're going, are firstly exploring the explanation for what was done to address the bug in the early 2000s. When Fujitsu was first aware that the Riposte lock could cause a balancing issue, who was aware of that issue, why it was allowed to remain outstanding until 2006, and did the fix, known as S90, work fully? Okay, so if we can just go through the chronology of the events and try and pick up those questions as we do.
Yes.
Again, this isn't a complete chronology. There are about 15 documents that I want to ask you about, but there are a very large number of additional documents and steps in the chronology. Can we start, please, with Fujitsu 0001 7986? This is a Pinnacle 00112751, and you'll see that it was opened on the 2nd of July 1998.
Yes.
And the opening summary at the top left-hand side is Riposte error, failure to get lock.
Yes.
Now, I appreciate that this is before your time by a couple of years in the SSC, but looking through this Pinnacle, is it right that this appears to be early evidence of the riposte lock?
It is an instance of a single riposte lock error. There's no mention in there of repeated events, which were it was when you got the repeated events that you might then also have additional problems. It might then affect the replication. One single event, we never had any evidence that caused any long-term problems. I'd also say I don't believe this is anything to do with the counter software. I don't think it was this process, BLD CD Dell, looks like one of the bulk loaders that would have been running on one of the Horizon back-end systems.
And so following from that, if we look at the last few entries on page 4, if we look at 6 lines up, Mr. Bell's entries, I've not seen this problem since the test rig was updated to riposte 216. Also, the network has been changed, so I'm closing this call. Does that tend to suggest that because the problem was not seen as at the 5th of October 1998, the Pinnacle was therefore closed, as an isolated example?
Yes, it was an example of a single riposte error, which I can't tell from this, but there's no evidence that this one single error, and you do get errors and your systems have to cope with this. There may be a good reason why it failed to get the lock and it reported it. So it's an instance of that particular error message. And yes, they didn't see any more of it on the test rig, so they closed the call.
And when you and other SSC staff, much later on, many years later on, were investigating the extent of the riposte lock bug and the duration of it, would this kind of Pinnacle have been available to you?
I don't recall how long Pinnacles were kept for. It might have been there, but looking at that, it bears absolutely no relevance to a counterbalancing problem found some years later.
So if you had access to it, you would have dismissed it as irrelevant?
Yeah.
Can we move forwards then, please, to FUJ 303 1913? We're now on the 5th of November 1999, so again before your time, but it's another Pinnacle opened concerning another riposte log. Yes?
Yes, it is, which happened at a particular time of day for a particular process.
And reading through the Pinnacle, would you agree that it appears that the SSE took no substantive action in relation to the log, and instead it was simply closed on the 11th of November 1999?
Assume it's closed further down. It was something ClearDesk failed to create training object. That is the overnight processing, starting things up again. It's trying to create something to do with the separate training service that ran on the counter. It looks like a single timeout message, and also this error occurred message. It doesn't show any lasting ongoing problem. It wouldn't affect replication in any way, so if it was just closed, I'm not surprised.
You're not surprised it was just opened and closed very quickly?
Yeah.
And can we move forwards then to the year 2000? FUJ 305 9049. You were in post by this time,
I'd been there about 3 weeks, I think.
yes. And we'll see that this is a KEL raised by Mr. Ballantyne on the 2nd of November and then closed by you in 2005.
Not closed, last updated.
Sorry, last updated by you. And if we see the solution, please, further down the page.
Yes, could I just say, sorry,
Yes,
before we
I'm
go
so
down, this error, where they're getting the error messages, committing the discrepancies and so on, this suggests that the underlying problem, which is happening, it's not preventing the replication between counters, it's actually a problem on this counter itself, where Riposte is trying to write messages into the message store on this particular counter, and it's not able to do so.
And so I'm not following for the moment what the point
Yeah.
is or the distinction you're making.
I think when I described the problem in my witness statement, I said the problem was the failure to replicate messages that were being done on one counter onto this counter that they were balancing on. This particular description, which I don't think I'd had the opportunity to remind myself of when I wrote that, it's clear that they are doing the work on this one counter, and then when in the balancing process it's trying to write the declarations and the discrepancies into the message store, it's unable to do that, presumably because this lock is held and so it can't write into its own message store.
And so this could afflict a single counter. Is that what you're saying?
It possibly could, yes, but because it can't commit or do any of these things, you're actually not going to be able to complete your balance process on this counter in the state that it's in at the moment anyway. But yes, reading it now, I think it might affect a single counter.
I see. In terms of the solution, just reading the solution to yourself, is it right that, in essence, the solution was to advise a restart by the sub-postmaster and to stop balancing if they were doing the balance?
That is the solution that was being given at that time, yes.
And how long was that solution?
That was
Stop balancing and do a restart?
That was for a long time because it took until 2006, I think, for us actually to get a fix for the problem.
And so was that the operative advice for about a 6-year period?
Yes, it would have been.
Can we look, please, at the peak to which this KEL is associated, 005 6922, and the peak is FUJ 307 0841. Now, again, you're in post by this time, but for a very short period of time. I'm not showing you the peak because you're mentioned in it. It's another in the line of documents evidencing the existence of the bug. Can we look at page 4, please? At the foot of the page, and mark Jarroz's entry at 10:35:00. Thank you. he says, my assessment of what happened is that on Wednesday the 1st of November at 18:32, 13 hours, a lock was acquired on the run table which was not released. This had the subsequent effect of causing, I think that's many, Riposte API calls to fail, and hence the applications connected to Riposte could not function reliably. I would speculate that the probable cause was a thread silently failing, but we have no way of proving this. I'll check with Isha to confirm my assessment is reasonable, and if not, further update this Pinnacle. In the meantime, I would recommend that in future recurrences, a restart of Riposte should be attempted prior to rebooting NT. If the frequency of occurrence of such an event becomes significant, more than one per month, then we will need to create a reproducible case. Can you explain what you understand Mr. Jarosz to be saying there?
Yarosh. Some process has failed, but it's not being picked up. He doesn't know what that will be. I don't think I can explain that very clearly technically. He was going to check with Escher, who owned the Riposte code, because this was the underlying product that Horizon was built around, which Fujitsu didn't support. And
the last part I'm interested in particularly, if the frequency of occurrence becomes significant, which he defines as meaning more than once per month, we'll need to create a reproducible case.
Yeah. So if it keeps happening more than once a month, then we're going to have to see if we can reproduce the problem, which actually we never managed to do.
Who would monitor whether such incidents concerning the Riposte lock were occurring at a rate of greater than or less than once per month?
I'm not sure that anybody was monitoring that at that point.
How would the proposal or conclusion or outcome that Mr. Jarosz has arrived at there be carried into effect then, or wouldn't it?
I don't know.
If nobody was monitoring the frequency with which such events occurred, it couldn't be, could it?
No, it couldn't. I don't know if any of my colleagues back then who were aware of this problem took it upon themselves to do such monitoring, but I certainly didn't do it because I hadn't been there very long and wasn't really aware of this problem at that point.
More generally, was there a system within the SSC of logging disparate pinnacles and peaks together so that some sort of meta-analysis could be carried out?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know if that's something that the SSC manager did have any systems in place for, but I'm not aware of that.
Were you ever requested to contribute to such a system, either in its design or providing data to it?
There certainly were occasions when I would do my own checks for similar calls happening, but I don't recall it being something that I was ever instructed to do.
So there was nothing to stop one peak coming into one person in the SSC and another coming into one of the other 24 people in the SSC about the same subject matter, and person one not knowing about person two's peak?
That could happen. I mean, what we did sometimes do was on the KEL say record further instances here. So then we did get a bigger picture, but that wasn't part of the process that anybody told us to do.
And it was a bit hit and miss, I think it's fair to say.
It could have been hit and miss, yes.
So when one looks at the KELs, one doesn't see a list of all associated peaks.
You would on some KELs for particular problems.
But not on many others.
Not on many others.
And were you conscious of this within the SSC at the time, thinking I'm working my way through my heap, my stack of tickets, I'm getting them in, dealing with them, getting them out, and there could be somebody else who's working a different shift to me, somebody home working, I don't know, or probably not home working in the SSC, but working a different shift, working on the other side of the room, and they could be exploring precisely the same problem and we don't know about it.
That is possible. Certainly if it was the same, at the same point in time, we'd almost certainly notice, just because you would keep an eye on the other calls that were open and you would see if somebody had a similar call, or the pre-scanner would say, oh, I've just given one that looks like this to so-and-so. But if they were, you know, several weeks apart, you would not necessarily make those links. Having said that, certainly we did talk to each other, and so we often did have a pretty good idea of other things that were happening, so you would get some sort of an idea of, you know, oh, there's another one of those sort of problems, but it wasn't being formally measured or managed.
There was no system in place.
No.
Can we look, please, at one of your KELs, poll 303 0325. This was a KEL, A Chambers 330S, raised by you about a month into your time, yes?
Yes.
On the 27th of November 2006, last updated by Mike Croshaw on the 20th of October 2006. And if you scroll down, please, looking at, without reading them out, symptoms and the problem, this looks like another similar example of the calendar square bug, doesn't it?
The KEL was originally raised for, very specifically, just for a single occurrence of the event at a particular point in processing during the LFS end of day processing, when it wouldn't have affected that's not part of the counterbalancing process. Where it goes on to say sometimes a storm of these events occurs, then that is what we have later called the calendar square bug.
The riposte lock, yes.
Yeah.
It said under solution that a single event can be ignored and do not pass further instances to SSC unless there appear to be side effects. Why was the KEL signed off in this way?
Because a single event is just, oh dear, riposte has had a slight problem. It's obviously recovered from it in that we've only got the one event. We haven't got ongoing problems. So if there don't appear to be any side effects, then it doesn't need any further investigation.
Was there a concern that too many issues were thereby being sent up to the SSC?
I'm not aware of that particular statement in that particular KEL causing that particular problem.
But the KEL is meant to discourage, isn't it?
It's meant
passing instances up to the SSC.
If just a single event has occurred.
Wouldn't you want to know where single events had occurred, if they were occurring as single events across the estate?
Not if they...
Wouldn't that help identify the problem?
It might have done if there was a problem caused by these events being raised. I realise we're getting into a chicken and egg situation here, but
I'm going to ask you about the chicken and egg situation in a moment.
Yes, I certainly wasn't trying to. I don't believe that KEL has been written in that way to necessarily stop anything being sent to SSC for any of these events. It was more written in the first place for the single event, I believe.
But this is addressed to HSH, isn't it, the solution, to the help desk?
It is, yes, saying a single event can be ignored.
Was there sufficient skill and expertise within the help desk team to identify whether or not a call related to a single event, or was in fact one of a series of events? How would they know?
Because if HSD or SMC were monitoring the events, they would see each event coming in as a separate entity from a specific branch.
What, a branch calling in?
No, this isn't a branch phoning in. This is the automatic feed they get through Tivoli of the events, the NT events that are being raised on a counter.
How would those lower levels of support identify if there were what is described as side effects?
If further processes started raising other events, if we're talking about the events, you might get one event saying, that a lock's held, and then other processes might then generate events because they couldn't do what they were meant to be doing. I mean, a lot of events were being raised all the time from a lot of different processes, not that many critical events. There were different categories of events. But we certainly didn't expect every single event being raised by the system always to be individually investigated.
Whether or not it required to be individually investigated or not, wouldn't it be important knowledge for the SSC to have as to the existence of these individual events, as you call them?
Quite honestly, I don't think we would have been able to do anything about them except to look at it and say, well, we can't see that it's caused any knock-on event on any other counter process. The only thing that perhaps it might then have had to go off to ESHA again to say, can you investigate, why we are getting these? But you do get unexpected errors happening on systems. Systems have to be written in a way where they can cope with unexpected errors at this sort of level.
Some of the errors were causing what you've described as side effects, and some were not.
I'm not sure if we ever... So yes, it's hard, very hard now to go back and say, if we had investigated a single event, we would have had to have looked at the bigger picture of which other processes had been impacted. Certainly this one just after midnight during LFS end of day processing, I think that one possibly did affect some counters that night, but not the balancing, just the LFS process, which didn't affect branch balancing in any way. I don't think I can add much more here.
Okay. Can we look at version 2 of this KEL, please, which is Fujitsu 3059141.
Which version was this that we were looking at?
This is version 1 we're looking at the moment. If we just scroll up, we can see the top of it. And now we're looking at version 2.
Right, so
If you scroll up,
version 1 must have been the update by Mike Croshaw in 2006.
yes.
Which is confusing, but the KEL system changed, I think, at that point, and that's why it went back to version 1, so there would have been earlier versions as well.
Okay, I'm not going to explore that further. Can we go to version 2 then, please? Fujitsu, you've got it, thank you. again, it shows correctly the first date that you raised this, Kel, 27th of November 2000. And we can see that this version 2 is last updated by your manager, Mr. Parker, on the 14th of June 2010. Can we take from that that this is confirmation that these lock-type problems were continuing to be experienced throughout the time that Riposte was in operation?
Well, firstly, I'd say I'm wondering if that's some sort of administrative update, given that we were just about to go live on to HNGX in 2010 at that point, or go fully live. I think we very occasionally did continue to see just a single event at odd times, but not the event storms that were happening during the balancing process, which we saw up to 2006.
And again, was there any method by which that data, from which I've called a meta-analysis, could be conducted, was retained?
Well, all the events were retained somewhere for some length of time.
Yes, in a system but not being looked at.
Yes.
I'm asking whether anyone, where a bug was identified like this, whether anyone in SSC or elsewhere, for example, in order to go to Isha to say, look, this is a continuing problem,
Yeah,
retained a data set that they could go to Isha with and say, this is a continuing problem. It's been going on for 10 years.
I know that in 2006, after the fix for the event storms went live, I did monitor for some time after that to see if the event storms stopped, and the event storms did stop. But there may have been the very, very occasional single event still happening. But it was the storms that seemed to cause the message store either not to replicate or it not to be possible to write to them. Otherwise, if you've just got a single problem, the processes would retry and it would work on the retry.
Can we turn, please, to Fujitsu 308 3548? This is an email exchange between Mr. Jenkins and Mark Jarosz and Brian Orzel. If we just read through the message at the top of the page together from Mr. Jenkins, I've had a look at this event log and I don't think there's anything to really worry about. Migration appears to have completed okay and the outlet is running fine on CI4. Was that a release, CI4?
Yes, I believe so.
I've seen a number of verification failures during migration before, and I believe they are to be expected during the various loads of Riposte before the counter reboot. However, I'm curious as to why we get the 3 errors mentioned in the Pinnacle. They occur at 26 hours on the 9th of November 2000. All are identical. Facility message processor error 94. Quote, an error occurred while attempting to destroy a checkpoint run. Timeout occurred waiting for lock. End quote. They seem to occur during the Riposte index rebuild immediately after the migration of the real message store. I assume they're benign. Would appreciate confirmation from Mark before closing the Pinnacle. On I'm not going to look at the rest of the message. For this kind of thing that Mr. Jenkins was doing, would you know that this kind of thing was going on? Either things that he is describing?
Well, he's referring to a peak 57478
Yes,
and mentioning 3 identical errors. I don't think that's the peak that we were
it's
looking
not,
at
no, it's
before.
a separate one entirely.
Right, so I think this is a different problem that we're looking at here, but a different problem, but yes, again, you've got the same underlying
The same underlying cause.
events.
Yep.
No, not the same underlying, not necessarily the same underlying cause, but the same events have been generated. In this time, it's during the phase of the index rebuild, and this is looking like it's part of the migration, so when branches are first moving on to Horizon. So yes, some riposte errors were looked at.
Can we move on, please, to Fujitsu 308 3574? Thank you, and look at the message in the middle of the page. Again, from Mr. Jenkins. Different pinnacle, 57957. He says this pinnacle is related to 56922, which you looked at a couple of weeks ago. That's not the one that we were just looking at. This is a third one.
And this looks like we're back to a problem in the LFS space, which is what that Kell of mine was talking about.
Yes, and he says, I've had a look through the message store and the event log and have noticed that at the time of this failure, 2 minutes past midnight essentially, that there is an LFS background task running. He says, next paragraph, I suspect it's significant that the riposte error is 10 seconds after the blob is written. What was the blob?
I think it was a binary large object.
What does that mean?
A big amount of data that was so big that it had to be written into a whole set of messages. It was too big to fit into one individual message.
He then says, next paragraph, as the Pinnacle says, this seems to be happening fairly frequently. Yes? And then
That's what it says, yes.
Yes, next paragraph, I do think we need a definitive statement from Drew. Do you know who Drew was?
No.
As to whether this event is benign or what problems we could have when it happens. Could it be due to an application error? Do we need to get more info on when these problems occur? It's clear the circumstances in this case are very different from those in the original Pinnacle. To your knowledge, at this time, we're late November 2000, but was this problem happening fairly frequently?
I don't know. I would say again, this isn't the problem with the repeated events that was affecting balancing.
And the reply at the top of the page, Mark Jarosz says, from your description, Gareth, it sounds as if we have potentially have a recipe for a reproducible case. Can you assist us with what a reproducible case is?
One where you could try the same process and reproduce and make the problem happen in a consistent way.
And what would be the purpose of forcing the problem to occur?
Well, if you can reproduce it, then you stand a much better chance of, firstly, finding the root cause, and secondly, being able to test to show that you have fixed the problem.
Can we move forwards, please, to Fujitsu 0008 3583? We can see Mark Jaroz's reply to Mr. Jenkins of the, I think the 1st of December 2000. It must be an Americanized date, I think. Hi, Gareth. I can confirm, having checked with Drew, that a timeout of this sort is likely to be benign in the sense that it should not result in a message store corruption. At this stage, can you remember whether you in the SSC were told about this investigation having taken place?
I have no recollection of this, and again, we're still talking about problems in the area of the LFS agent, which is nothing to do with counterbalancing.
So at the moment, would you draw a distinction to say this isn't really directly relevant to the bug that we're looking at?
Yes.
And therefore you didn't need to know about it?
Personally, probably not, no. I mean, there was an awful lot to learn about when I first started, as you can imagine.
Yes. Can we move forward a couple of years then, please, and look at Fujitsu 308 3633. You'll see that this is a peak 0083563, opened on the 7th of November 2002. And can we look at your entry, please, at 162700, which is at towards the bottom of the page. You say, following critical event generated on various FADs, that's by various branches, is that right? Or about various branches?
Yes, at various branches, not raised by various branches.
No, yes, about various branches, thank you. The call summary is now many run map critical events on various branches. Response: these events were investigated in the past, and you give a peak number, but the call was closed on the basis that the errors were no longer occurring. Analysis of the events in the last month shows 2,132 of these events. In many cases, there is just one or a small number on effective counters, but, and then you give a branch number, generated over 900 in one day, and 191,323 over 100, presumably that's 100 days.
No, that would be 100 events.
Over 100
Sorry,
events.
that's the 191323 is a branch code, a FAT
I've got
code.
it. Right, so there's two branches you're referring to.
Yeah,
The first one generated over 900 in one day,
yeah.
and the second branch over 100 in one
Yeah.
day. Thank you, I understand. And then if you look down the rest of the peak, the trail seems to go cold. Nothing happens.
Yes, I'd asked for the call to be raised so that I could do some background investigation into these events, which I had noticed and I was concerned about because they were happening. But there was a call that I sent to development, or was sent to development at around the same time for them to investigate.
But there appears to be a 4-month gap between your entries of the 7th and 8th of November and your entry of the 24th of February.
Yes. It was something I was doing as a background task because I was concerned about the events.
But what was happening in the meantime to these two branches that you mention here?
I can't remember now if I looked to see, I mean, the branches, the events would only have they had happened on those particular days, the events didn't keep having they didn't keep affecting the same branches over and over again. And whether I did look back to see if the events had had any impact on the branches on those days, or whether they had raised calls to say they were having issues, I now cannot remember.
But if you had have done that, you would have noted it on this peak, wouldn't you? For the branch you'd had at 900 events in one day, and the other branch you'd had over 100 events in one day.
Yes, I mean, these events didn't necessarily mean that they did have balancing problems. It just meant they could in the majority of cases.
But you don't know until you look, do you?
That's true, and I cannot say now whether I did look at those at that point. It may be that, you know, at this point, I'm not sure when we first realised that it was tending to happen more when they were doing their balancing, and therefore it might have an effect. But yes, it obviously was important to look, and as I say in my witness statements, I'm not at all happy about how this was handled over the years.
When you say that, do you mean by Fujitsu?
Yes, by Fujitsu, by SSC, by all of us. We could have done better.
And in relation to your part in that, you made a record on the 7th of November that in the last month there were 2,132 of these events, and you highlighted two branches, one where 900 events had happened in one day and another where over 100 events had happened. If you had investigated whether any of those events had caused discrepancies, you would have noted it down on this peak, wouldn't you?
Yes, if I had been aware that there were discrepancies, that they had persisted through the event storm and had managed to balance, and it looked as if they did have discrepancies as a result, then I probably would have recorded it. If I had looked and seen that either they'd realised they'd had a problem, had phoned for advice and had rebooted and then done their balancing, I probably wouldn't have recorded that. But since I didn't record anything, I don't know.
Were you essentially relying on sub-postmasters to spot a problem and call it in?
I certainly think at this time with this problem, we did assume that they would notice that either that they were getting error messages, as we saw in one of the peaks you just showed me, where they got error messages because they couldn't commit the declarations or whatever else. So they definitely know they had a problem in that case. In other cases, we certainly did get some where they phoned in and they said, we're balancing, our figures are all over the place, and then the help desk would advise them to reboot, and then it would be okay when they restarted.
Can we move forwards again, please, to look at Fujitsu 308, excuse me, 3651. This is a peak 0086212, opened on the 24th of January 2003. And can we look, please, at your entry on the 29th of January at 11:31, which is in the bottom half of the page. Thank you. You say it looks as if there was a problem with last week's balance, cut-offs and some final OBCS transactions were done on counter 3. Then balancing continued on counter 4, but this did not seem to know what had been done on counter 3. There were many underlying riposte timeout messages. The transactions were entered again, I need to ascertain whether they were sent to tip twice and whether the postmaster is out of pocket. Have spoken to the postmaster, who confirms there were problems and is worried that they may continue this week. I'll contact her tomorrow AM to see how they have got on. So there you're essentially describing in a single paragraph the operation of the calendar square bug, as I have summarised it, in existence on the 29th of January 2003.
Yes.
And then if we can look at your entry a couple of days on, the 31st of January at 16:09, you say, postmaster balance okay. She's reversed the transactions, which she had to re-enter. The original ones were included in the new cap. This was all caused by counter 4 being unable to see messages recently written on counter 3 when the stock unit was being balanced. There's no accounting discrepancy here, but there is a problem in that the postmaster was allowed to balance with no warning that the counters weren't communicating. MSU informed that I'm sending this to development for further investigation.
Yes.
And so would you have informed the MSU here?
Yes, I would have informed MSU. Because this call was raised not by the postmaster, but because of an entry on one of the reconciliation reports. At this point in time, the cash account was so when the branch balanced, they did their balance reports, then they produced a cash account on the counter. But the cash account was also reconstructed at the data centre from the transactions that had been harvested, had reached the data centre, and a comparison was done line by line to make sure that the two were in step. And in this case, they weren't, because the data centre, when it did its recalculation, knew about these counter 3 transactions, which hadn't been picked up when the branch cash account was produced. So there was a mismatch, and a reconciliation call was raised to investigate why that had happened. So in this case, that's how we knew about the problem. I did phone the branch to see what had happened, whether they had realised there was a problem. They had put these transactions in again because they didn't think they'd had them once. But then, because the original transactions hadn't been included in the accounts for the period that they'd just balanced, they automatically got carried forward and then were picked up in the new period. So in order to avoid them going through twice, she was then able to do a reversal on them, which sorted out her branch accounts. But obviously, yes, there was still a system problem.
And that's why you sent it to development for further investigation?
So I sent it to development for further investigation.
And if we just go forward to complete the story on this peak, to page 4. Um, 2 years on, there's a record at the top of the page for the 5th of October 2005. This call is one of a set approved by Mick Peach for closure without further action. Was that because the fix was then thought to be the S90 release?
I doubt it. I don't know. I'm not very happy with that.
Do you know...
was there anything above that at all to say if anybody had looked at it?
You can look back, please, at page 2. I don't think there's anything relevant on your entry on the 3rd of Feb. If you scroll to the bottom half of the page, you'll see 2 customer calls. If you just read those.
Oh, I think that just happened automatically when we moved from Pinnacle to Peak, or something
Yeah,
changed, and
not-
all the calls had to be closed and reopened, and then everything got written in again.
So nothing of substance there.
Nothing of
Then on to
substance.
page 3.
No, OTIs.
Nothing there.
Yeah, nothing
And
there.
then bottom half of the page.
No,
Nothing there.
No.
It's just closed off,
it
isn't
was
it?
just closed off.
And why are you unhappy? Or not very happy?
I'm unhappy with myself because I should have made it something more than a C priority. I left it at the priority that it had come from MSU in the first place. And I should have shouted a lot louder about the fact that this needed looking at. As time went by, I got better at shouting louder.
And who would you shout to?
Oh, anybody who'd listen.
But meaning who? Mr. Peach?
Yeah, Mr. Peach, development team.
So in essence, this call is closed off without anything having been done on it for 2 years.
Yes.
That one way of describing that is suboptimal, isn't it?
You could say that.
Can we look at a different peak, please? Poll 400996. This is peak 0103864, opened on the 3rd of June 2004. And the summary postmaster reports he had a problem with some transfers. And I think, without going into the detail, the peak describes the problem where multiple transfers occurred to a stock unit.
Yes.
Can we go forward to page 6, please? And in the middle of the page, at the 6th of July, thank you, at 11:47:27, you've written, I've checked with Mike King, the BIMS report for this problem was sent to Pole on the 22nd of June and should have resulted in an error notice being sent to the branch. Mike says he will send a note to Pole saying that the postmaster has been chasing this issue. I've asked the help desk to inform the postmaster that they should have received an error notice and to check with the department that issues them. The corrected cash account that was sent still had a receipts and payments mismatch. The double transferring causes a mismatch both because of the transfer and because of the discrepancy which has been erroneously generated. The host calculated cash account ignores the transfer but is still affected by the accepted discrepancy which should not have been generated. It's not really possible to provide a fully balanced cash account. And there's an email on this subject.
I think we discussed this one yesterday.
Yeah. You're recorded as dealing with the BIMS here on the 6th of July 2004. Can you explain, please, again, exactly what you're doing there?
Yes, I wasn't personally involved with the BIMS. I checked with Mike, who was the person who had sent the report to Post Office about the discrepancy that shouldn't have happened at this branch.
And so are you just identifying that there's been a delay here?
Yes, I think so. I think further up the call, Catherine had been dealing with it. She had sent the information to Mike in MSU, informing Post Office of this discrepancy that the branch should not be held liable for. The branch had not held anything. They were chasing it back. So the call ended up with me. So I followed it up as best I could with Mike.
Again, can we go forwards in the tail, please, to 2005, 2006, and look at poll 3030241. This is a chain of email correspondence on Calendar Square itself.
Yes.
Once the bug had seemingly been identified and discovered within the post office. And we should just set the context by starting at the foot of page 9 and onto page 10 with an email from Sandra McKay of Pole to Brian Potter of Pole. And this is just to set the context for what happens later in the chain. Can you see I've said that's to Brian Potter. If we just go up, it's to Sean Turner, copy to Brian Trotter. Just trying to work out. Ah, yes. Sean says, Gary, need your advice on this branch. There appears to be an ongoing problem at this branch with transfers between stock units causing a receipts and payments mismatch. This first came to my attention some 3 or 4 months ago when the branch was chasing up an error notice to account for a loss they had that was related to the receipts and payments mismatch. I believe in that case that FS, Fujitsu, I think, had taken it on board and were investigating it as a problem. I seem to recall it had a pinnacle number. I had to do some chasing around with P&BA, Product and Branch Accounting, to ensure that the error notice got issued, as there was a breakdown in processes between them and Fujitsu relating to the BIM report. Since then, it appears to have happened again, although Fujitsu are saying no issue could be detected. I'm concerned there's a fundamental flaw with the branch's configuration and will be interested to know how Fujitsu put the issue to bed. And then if we go further up on page 9 and onto page 8, and if we just scroll gently up, we can see that this gets passed around essentially within Fujitsu, within Pole, yes?
Liz Evans-Jones was Fujitsu.
Yeah, so it goes over to Liz Evans-Jones from the 15th of February 2006 from Gary Blackburn. Liz, I've had the incident detail below forwarded to myself by our service line. Could you please update me on the corrective action plan as this still appears to be occurring within the branch? And then if we go further up to page 8, Miss Evans-Jones replies, I have checked the call and this issue is scheduled to be resolved in S90. Can you, in a sentence or two, describe what S90 was?
It was a fairly major release of updated software. I can't remember what functionality it included, but there were new areas of functionality coming in sort of fairly frequently, and so as a part of that there would be some bug fixes, and this was scheduled to be one of them.
So a scheduled software release.
A scheduled major software release which would have been through a very thorough test cycle.
And it was proposed to include this fix within S90?
Yes.
S90 has already been deployed to the data center and counter release is scheduled to start, and then there's some dates. Third line support has been discussing with the postmaster. The last contact with the branch, according to PowerHelp, was the 1st of February. The call has been left open for third line to check to see if the issue reoccurs following S90. Please let me know if I can provide any other assistance. And then continue scrolling up, please. And again, please. We can then see some passing essentially back down the chain of Liz Evans-Jones's reply within Pole. Yes?
Yes.
On page 7, keep scrolling up. And keep scrolling up again. Thank you. And then if we just scroll down a bit so we can see that it's Mr. Turner asking these questions. Thank you, Sean Turner, yes. And then just scroll back up. Thank you. He says, back to Mr. Blackburn, Gary, thanks for looking into this for us. A couple of questions occur. Do we understand why this particular branch has been having problems? Or are there other branches in the network that have been having this problem? Could this branch be front-ended on the counter release of S90 such that it gets the fix as soon as possible? The email from Liz suggests there may be a recurrence following S90. What degree of certainty do we have that it will definitely be fixed? So some pretty direct and pertinent questions there from Mr. Turner, yes?
Yes.
Sandra, Brian, appreciate this is frustrating for the branch, but from the email below, you can see the branch's issue should be fixed within the release of the S90 software. I've asked Gary above to see if we can put this branch to the front of the queue. In the meantime, it's important the branch continues to report any issues into the help desk. So the four or five rather pertinent questions that Mr. Turner asks, if we scroll up, please. We then see these getting passed around within Fujitsu. Keep scrolling, please. Keep scrolling. Keep scrolling. And then keep scrolling again. Keep scrolling. And again. And again. Thank you. We can see an email from Mr. Stewart to Mr. Simpkins copied to you. Why were you copied in?
I think, as Mike says below, as Anne is away, could I have your comments as you were involved as well?
That's saying why John is asked the questions, but why was this addressed to you?
Well, before that, it's Anne. You're always a good place to start. So it was me being a good place to start.
But why were you, I'm so sorry, why were you the good place to start?
Because I knew what was going on. And because I had to put an update on that call there that's at the very bottom of the screen. So I'd obviously had some involvement
With this bug?
with this bug, as far as I can see.
And if we scroll down, we can see what Mr. Stewart asked. He cuts in his explanation of the position. Yes?
He's pasted in my update from Pinnacle there.
Yes.
And then where it says I notice, that I believe is his words from that point.
Yes, I noticed that in the early guise of this problem in the call, it states the PM as female. Yes?
Yes, that's what
And then some more cutting and pasting.
Yes, then.
And then back to
then
him.
Then that's what the help desk had put on the call. Yes.
At the bottom of this email, a magical £43,000 appearing and disappearing. The PM is male. He reports, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then scroll down, please. He says, clearly the sub-postmaster is concerned as we've just spent a number of months trying to sort out the first instance and he doesn't want to repeat performance. He's convinced that there's something wrong with his Horizon kit. I'd be grateful if you could investigate this and give him any support you can. I'm due to visit the office tomorrow to have a look at his paperwork and discuss the situation.
Again, isn't that a cut and paste from something that somebody in the post office had said earlier in the chain?
I'm not sure that it is. I thought that was...
I don't think Mike would have been visiting offices.
No. I think you're probably right then. Can we go to your answer then, please? On page 3 of this email chain. At the foot of the page. You respond, Mike, haven't looked at the recent evidence, but I know in the past this site had hit this riposte lock problem 2 or 3 times within a few weeks. This problem has been around for years and affects a number of sites most weeks. Is it right that this riposte problem had been around 4 years.
Yes, because we had been seeing it since at least the end of 2000.
So 5.5, 6 years.
Yeah.
Your witness statement, there's no need to turn it up, I don't want to disrupt the narrative, says at paragraph 76, you personally had known about this riposte lock problem since soon after I had arrived at the SSC in 2000. And that's a reference back to those November 2000 peaks we looked at, is that right?
Yes, although I think when I wrote the witness statement, I'm not sure that I'd actually seen the dates on those, but yes, it was a known problem.
So that reflects the early peaks that we saw of November 2000 and the
I
early
believe
KEL
so,
that we
yes.
saw of
Yeah,
November 2000.
yeah.
In relation to the part of your sentence which says this affects a number of sites most weeks, how did you know that it affects most sites? Sorry, it affects a number of sites most weeks.
Because of the event storms that we could see, I would say that I think it was something that did seem to have increased as time went by. I don't believe we were seeing all these event storms several times, a bit affecting many branches all the way through, although actually since I wasn't necessarily checking, I don't know. But when I say it affects them, I mean that we could see if we looked that event storms were happening. It does not mean that it necessarily had any impact on their branch accounts. I'm not saying that every week a number of sites were having incorrect discrepancies because of this problem.
But you didn't know one way or the other.
We would have known, okay, it's slightly peripheral. Some aspects, including the transfer problem and the rolling over without the transactions included, would have caused entries on the reconciliation reports, certainly up to 2005, so those would all have been investigated as they happened. And I'm certainly not aware, I don't remember that every week we were having a branch or two with those reconciliation report entries.
But Mrs. Chambers, this is a problem that's been going on for 5 or 6 years.
Yes, and if we had been getting all those reconciliation report entries at that sort of level for 5 years, it would absolutely definitely have been picked up and seen as being a big ongoing problem.
But isn't that relying on sub-postmasters, to an extent relying on sub-postmasters calling in?
Not the reconciliation
No.
report entry reports.
No, the other part of the answer that you gave.
But the other part of them phoning and saying, oh, I'm doing my balancing and it's all gone haywire. Yes, for us to know about it, they would have had to have phoned in and that call would have had to be passed through to SSC, and it's quite probable that the majority of those calls were not passed to SSC because they were just being told to reboot.
Yeah. Did you know how many sites were affected every week?
No, I could have known if somebody had asked me to monitor that. And obviously at the point that I was doing some analysis, then I did know. And I think I found, I can't remember what period it was, and that previous KEL we looked at, previous peak we looked at, where I did do some monitoring, and I'd found 2 branches with the event storms. But as I say, I can't now remember what length of time that was over.
You continue in that sentence, and finally, Isha say they have done something about it.
Yes.
In your witness statement, you say that I and others in the SSC understood the cause of the problem was to be a problem in the riposte software, which we thought was being investigated by Isha. Of the 5 or 6 year period that we're looking at, for how long had you thought that Isha had been investigating the issue?
I thought they'd known about it all the time. I now think, well, I now know, putting all the calls together and so on, that that's extremely unlikely.
What had gone wrong?
Nobody was managing it as a problem. It was almost impossible for SSC staff to see which calls were with Escher and who was progressing those, because they sort of went on to a separate peak stack, which I now know, yes, we could see, but I don't think at the early days I knew quite where it was. And it wasn't SSC's job, really, to be monitoring those, but I'm not sure whose job it was. Yeah, I think if we'd appreciated that nobody effectively was looking at this for all that time, we would have flagged it up and jumped up and down. But that realisation just didn't come until late in the day, when finally we did send a call over. It did get picked up eventually and sent to Escher, and they did produce a fix.
You say you were interested in whether they have really fixed it.
Oh, I never believe anything anybody tells me. You check, you double check, you triple check.
Was that more directed to what you knew about Isha, rather than being cynical about the world in general?
No, I was cynical about the world in general.
You therefore left the call open, the peak open.
Yeah.
If we turn up paragraph 81 of your witness statement, please, on page 26. Page 26, please. Paragraph 81 at the top. You say, I'm asked whether post office or sub-postmasters were told about the problem. It was not raised as a wider problem with post office. Each instance was treated individually. So does that mean until that email chain that we picked up a moment ago, that post office was kept in the dark for the best part of 6 years?
I'm not sure they were intentionally kept in the dark, but I think they were in the dark, yes.
And you say each instance was treated individually. But why was each case treated individually?
Because we would look at the calls that did come through, where they came through to us, and if there was an effect on the branch accounts, then we would pass the information via MSU to post office on a BIMS report, or it was passed that way.
This had been a problem that had been around for 5 or 6 years. Would you accept that Fujitsu had failed properly to investigate and address the bug?
Yes.
And failed to tell, I'm not saying you personally, failed to tell the post office about its existence?
Yes, I think because it was always treated as individual instances, it wasn't raised as a problem and flagged through to post office.
You said in your email that you wanted to wait and see to see whether the S90 release was an effective fix. Was that a case of waiting to see whether any more calls came in from sub-postmasters? And if so, whether any of those calls could be linked to the riposte lock problem?
No, I monitored the events coming through the system to see if there were any more of these event storms occurring anywhere.
And to complete the loop, if we may look at the last couple of documents, Fujitsu 0008 3667. This is a peak 0127246, opened on the 12th of October 2005. If we look at page 3, and the entry for 11/14/22 at the top of the page, you say since the release S90 was distributed, the number of these timeout events over the whole estate has gone right down with no storms from an individual counter. So it looks as if the riposte change has been effective.
Yes.
Was that your measure of working out whether the fix had been effective?
Yes.
Was there any other means of working out whether the fix had been effective?
I think that was a reasonable check of whether the fix had done what was expected of it. Obviously, if after this we got more calls about balancing issues, failure to replicate across counters and so on, then they would be investigated from scratch again.
Lastly, can we look at an email exchange, please, between you and Mr. Jenkins from 2010? That's Fujitsu 0008 3722. If we look at the email at the foot of the page, please. Can you see your email from you to Mr. Jenkins?
Yes.
And you forward, I think, if you look underneath it, the chain from back in 2006 that we see.
Yes.
Why were you doing this?
I presume he had contacted me and asked me what I could remember about the Calendar Square problem.
Can you remember why in February 2010 Mr. Jenkins would be contacting you about what had happened to the Calendar Square bug back in 2006?
No, I don't remember specifically why. It might have been because he was involved in a prosecution and wanted to know some of the details in case this was raised. I did my best to provide some information for him.
So let's see what you told him. Please, if we just scroll up, please. You say, Gareth, and you give a reference to Kel. I'd forgotten this did give a discrepancy, but also a receipts and payments mismatch. If they persisted and rolled over, it was usually obvious that something was wrong. And a flood of NT events, not riposte events, which SMC should have noticed at the time. Since we're now checking for these particular events and did a catch-up for old retrievals, can you say that the current branch did not have this problem? What were you referring to when you were saying, can you say that the current branch?
That suggests he was asking me about some specific branch and could we see if they had had the Calendar Square problem or not. But I now don't know which the current branch would have been.
Would you interpret that as meaning, can you say in the evidence that you are to give that the current branch did not have this problem?
I cannot remember precisely why he was asking me, but that is a possibility.
You say, anyway, it stopped happening once S90 was installed. This particular problem would only affect branches with more than one stock unit. It happened several times at Calendar Square, though we never found out why they were so badly affected. Is this sufficient? The line, this particular problem would only affect branches with more than one stock unit. Was that accurate?
That was accurate if we were talking about the Calendar Square part of the riposte lock problem. Calendar Square had the very specific problem of being able to do the transfer ins multiple times. So that's what I was referring to there. You could only do transfers out and in if you had more than one stock unit. I mean, there may well have been a separate email or two or a discussion behind this specific email, but I cannot remember now.
And then scrolling up to see what Mr. Chambers' reply was, Mr. Jenkins' reply was, thanks, Anne. Penny, is that Miss Thomas?
I would think so, yes.
Pointed out on Friday that the post office have not asked us to retrieve any data for this branch yet. Therefore, we have no message stores to check against event logs. This will probably do me for now. Does the case of Seema Misra ring any bells with you?
I've obviously heard the name, yes.
Is that recently seen the name or something you recall being asked about back in 2010 and Mr. Jenkins' preparation to give evidence in the Seema Misra case?
I think it's likely I had some involvement back then, but I cannot remember definitely which case that was.
Can you remember the context of this exchange, i.e. he was asking you for what he should say or things to say by reference to your work and your understanding of the issue in the Seema Misra case?
I thought he was just sort of checking with me just to see what I knew in general about the problem and so on, what my recollection of it was.
Thank you. Mr. Chambers, they're the only questions I ask you at the moment. I'm going to have to draw a line under bug 2 and ask you about the remainder of things when you come back in at the future for your phase 4 evidence. I need to allow a reasonable amount of time for other people to ask their questions. Thank you very much for the evidence you've given. So might that be an appropriate moment to take a 10-minute break for the
Yes.
15-minute break she's mouthing to me until 3:35?
Well, on the basis of the guesstimates that you were provided by your colleagues yesterday, that should provide sufficient time to finish by around about 4:15.
Yes, I think so.
Fine. All right.
Thank you very
that's
much.
fine.
So thank you. Can you see and hear us?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Thank you very much. I think Mr. Steen is going to ask questions first.
Right.
Mrs. Chambers, I ask questions on behalf of a large number of sub-postmasters and mistresses on behalf of a firm of solicitors called Howe & Co. You've given evidence and been asked a large number of questions by Mr. Beer, so I don't need to cover those areas. You said as part of your evidence that on some CALs you would see associated issues but not all. You also said, as part of your evidence today, that sometimes you would speak to your colleagues and then you would discover that they'd been dealing with another matter in the last few weeks. Now, help us a little bit with the question of duplicates. There was a system that we know that the first tier of the helpline were discouraged from sending through duplicates to the third, fourth lines. Now, would you see on your CALs that there were duplicates?
You mean if the help desk had used the same CAL for various tickets that they had received?
If they had recognised what they thought or believed was a CAL that was the same as one that was already being dealt with, would you see that?
Not automatically, no, but obviously some CALs would say, send the call to SSC, even though it's logged as a known problem, we would still make it clear on the KEL that we still needed to see the call if that was thought to be appropriate.
So if you didn't see some of the issues that were coming through because they were thought to be duplicates and therefore shouldn't go to third or fourth line support, does that mean that you were not always aware of how many calls were being made through to the helpline on the same issues?
That's true if it was something that there was a resolution or possibly a workaround which they could tell the postmaster about themselves.
Who provided the training to the first line support, the first line help desk, call answerers, so that they could recognise that this was the same or a different KEL? Who provided that training?
I don't know who provided their training.
Or were you ever asked to provide such training?
No.
Now, during the evidence in this inquiry, many of our clients who are ex-sub-postmasters mistresses said that their accounts, their branch accounts, never seemed to balance. So that was Janice Adams. Mujadid Faisal Azid explained that there were very many shortfalls that they had to balance by paying in cash. Edward Brown said similar matters occurred to him and that it wasn't always a large shortfall, but sometimes it could be into the thousands. And Gary Brown reported that the shortfalls happened so often that it was hard to keep track. Can you help us understand how it was that the sub-postmasters and mistresses experienced so many shortfalls?
No, I can't. And it obviously concerns me if this was happening and they weren't being given assistance by anybody to get to the bottom of these problems.
And you've mentioned at the closing part of your statement, paragraph 212, I'll read it out, that a point of frustration with the system was that the users, namely the sub-postmasters, were not our clients. And there was a practical limit as to the extent to which we could work together with them to investigate problems. Was that true, this difficulty, having that separation?
Yes, I mean, we had no ability to find out what was actually taking place at the branch. I'm not necessarily saying it was they were making errors that were causing these problems, but where we were checking by one means or another that the system was correctly calculating discrepancies based on the transactions that had been recorded on the system for the branch, then if that calculation and those checks show no problems, then you've got to try and find out what has been recorded in the branch accounts or what is missing in the branch transaction list, which is causing the discrepancy. And unless you've got some way of going to a branch and actually finding out what should have gone onto the system, then you cannot identify the cause of the discrepancy.
When you say, paragraph 212, that the sub-postmasters were not your clients, your client was the post office?
Yes.
Excuse me one moment. Thank you, Mrs. Chambers.
Mrs. Chambers, just one matter. It's one document. Fujitsu 20138-385.
I'm sorry, but I can't hear you very clearly.
I'll speak up then and get closer to the microphone. Sorry, Mrs. Chambers.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's just one document. Fujitsu 20138-385. And it should go onto the screen, and it's on the screen now. Thank you. And the subject line, the title is Requesting Journal Data from Audit. The author is you, Mrs. Chambers, and it's created on the 25th of August 2011.
Yes.
So that's after the migration to HNGX or Horizon Online, however one terms it. And we see from this document that All journal messages arriving at the data centre are retained for audit. Occasionally, SSC may need to ask for data to be retrieved to enable issues which happened more than 6 months ago to be investigated. And then in brackets, less than 6 months, there may still be sufficient and more accessible information in BRSS. When asking for transactions for a FAD, and that's a branch, isn't it?
That's a branch.
And date range, ask for query_at /final/filteredhx.xml file, which will contain all transactions for a given data range and FAD code in XML format. These will, however, lack the JSN and rec message ID. The alternative is raw files containing data for all 80 or so branches in the FAD hash, which is far harder to read, but does contain JSN and rec message ID. Route the peak with the request to security ops. If you think the call may be part of a post office investigation into a branch that might lead to litigation, then this should not be handled by SSC unless already authorised by the SSC manager. So it follows from this document that, as we're already aware, different forms of audit data provided different information to analysts.
Yes.
Yeah. So here, it refers to raw files of data or raw data as one type of data available.
One type of data is the raw files.
Yeah,
yes.
and then there's the XML files as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the raw files of data, the raw data, would contain information not contained in the XML file.
Yes, I cannot now remember precisely what the details are, but obviously there's two fields there that might have been of use.
How frequently would raw data be requested in your experience?
I can't remember ever personally actually requesting journal data from audit. I almost certainly did on occasion, but I've got no memory of doing it. It certainly wasn't a frequent thing.
Yeah. And why would the peak and request have to go to security ops, as is said in the third line from the bottom?
Because they were the ones who could access this data and they had to extract it from the audit servers. Only they could do that.
Right. And how would an SSC analyst be aware that a request might lead to litigation?
Not might lead to, but might already be part of a post office. Oh, sorry, yes. It would just depend, where the call had come from, if anybody had mentioned this. I don't know. I mean, how we would tell that now, I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah. Because this does say that if you think the call may be part of a post office investigation into a branch that might lead to litigation, then this should not be handled by SSC unless already authorised by the SSC manager. Why would the request not be handled by SSC unless already authorised by the SSC manager?
I presume I was told that. I'm not sure. I mean, this is an unusual situation if we are asked to investigate something that happened more than 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Normally would have been investigating things that had happened recently. So I presume that was what I was told, and that is why I added that into the work instruction, but I cannot remember any conversation about that.
So this is a work instruction, is the term that you've just used, is that right?
Sorry, yes, a WI is a work instruction.
Work instruction. And you would have been told that if it was part of a post office investigation into a branch that might lead to litigation, then it shouldn't be handled by SSC unless already authorised by the SSC manager.
I appear to have included that in the work instruction, so I assume that was what I was told.
So did you understand why it was that you were told that this should be included in the work instruction?
Because presumably in that case, Post Office would be putting in their own request for the data.
And why would that need to be authorised by the SSC manager?
I just, because I was told that. I'm sorry, I have no real recollection of this. I don't recall being told it. I don't actually recall writing the work instruction, but I obviously did.
Just to float one possible reason, could it be a reason of payment for this type of request?
That may have come into it because I think Post Office were, they were charged for data retrievals, but yeah, I think this would be better directed at one of my managers, probably.
No, of course, and I only ask you because you're the author of this document, Ms. Chambers.
Yes, I suspect Steve or somebody said, oh, this ought to be in a work instruction, can you create one?
Well, that was the final question I had for you, which is, in what capacity were you providing direction of this nature to your colleagues?
You know, obviously, I would have a good understanding of the technical messages and the content of the messages and so on, or a reasonable understanding of that. And yeah, I wrote a work instruction. I'm sorry, I don't really remember any more about it than that.
Yeah. And would, given that you didn't know really why that final 3 lines, or rather the final 2 lines, were included within this work instruction, or you can't remember why, would this have been better being a work instruction emanating from your manager rather than from you?
Yes, it probably would have been, but if a work instruction was felt to be needed for something, then somebody might well be asked to just, oh, could you write that work instruction? But that didn't mean that all the content necessarily came from me. We could all write work instructions, and it was the sort of job that got shared out amongst us.
Thank you very much, Mrs. James.
Picking up.
Do you want to swap?
Oh, no, it's picking up now. There we are. I'm so sorry. Can I just ask those in front of me to just sit as they normally do so I can see the witness? Thank you. Thank you very much.
I still can't hear you terribly clearly.
Is that any better?
That's better, thank you.
Thank you. So it's Flora Page, also acting for a number of the sub-postmaster call participants. I'd like to take you to 2 documents. They're both peaks, and or possibly one might be a pinnacle, and they both deal with the process that you went through in order to insert transactions to ensure that the accounts were balancing properly. So the first one is FUJ 2015 2239. And what we can see is that the summary at the top shows us that the office can't balance as there are incorrect fees on POs, and I think that stands for postal orders.
Yes, it does.
We can see that this dates from July of 2001. And if we then, I don't think we need to see anything in the first few dealings, but if we go down to page 4, and we can see that it starts off in your department with Barbara Longley, who's the administrator. That's right, isn't it? And then we see that John Simpkins initially picks this up, and we can see that he has, or somehow, about halfway down the page, he's noticed, he says pre-scan, check date time runs in message store for time BU was swapped. So we can see that a base unit has been swapped out. Is that fair?
Yes, that would be fair.
And then if we go a bit further down, John Simpkins has assigned this to you, team member Anne Chambers, or somehow it has been assigned to you. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then he says that it might be a problem due to the corrupt storage unit. Check the message store for any corrupt entries, then insert a rem out for PO fees.
I see that.
Yeah, but if we then go over the page, you seem to take a slightly different view at one point, but we'll go through it logically. At 1541, you say it looks as if adjust stock on 4th July was showing incorrect figures, and then you've referenced to Kell. As a result, the PM did a couple of sets of unnecessary SAPs after base units swapped, it seems. And then if we go down to almost to the bottom of the I'm so sorry, to about 4 lines below that, you say, I've raised OCR A Chambers to allow us to correct the message store. So that's an instance, is it, of you saying that you need to go through the change control process to insert transactions. Is that right?
That appears to be what I did. I have to say I have no recollection of this at all.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay.
It's obviously going back a very long way, isn't
Yeah.
it? So then it says below that, incident under investigation. And then if we go further down, we can see new evidence added. And I'd just like to try and understand what these evidence types are. We've got new evidence added full message store. Then we've got new evidence added audit logs. And then we've got new evidence added PS standard logs. Is full message store the equivalent of what became the ARQ data?
No, it's not. It would include all the ARQ data, but it's all the messages for the branch that were in existence on the day and time that I did the retrieval. I'd have retrieved it from the copy of the message store that was held on the correspondence server centrally. And so it's all the transaction messages and a lot of other messages that have been written in the last 42 days, it would have been at this point, plus all the reference data relating to the branch. But the ARQ data is the same data, but it's captured in a different way.
But that last bit you said is the bit that I wanted to get at. It is the same data, is it?
It's the same data which I'd retrieved from the correspondence server, but the messages as they came in from, I think it was happening all the time, as they came in from the branch to be fed into the correspondence server message store, there was a stream of them going out all the time into the audit files. So the ordering, in particular reference data and so on, would be rather different, but overall it's the same data.
So that's the evidence that could be captured for a significant period of time afterwards and that was stored.
The ARQ
Yes.
data files were kept for a significant amount of time. The message store, some of the messages persisted, but others would be archived or deleted after 42 days.
All right, so it's not identical. All right, well then audit logs, what is that? Is that identical with ARQ or not?
No, this is the files that I had totally forgotten about until Mr. Beer reminded me of their existence yesterday, I think it was, which were kept on the counters, were written on the counters and contained a certain amount of diagnostic information written to the file by the counter application as things were done. I've got very little recollection of precisely what that looked like.
And then PS standard logs, what are they?
That's another counter log file in which you could see messages to and from the counter peripherals, things like the printer and the barcode reader. and so on.
And none of that was kept for any significant period of time, is that
No,
fair?
that
Right.
wasn't kept, and it normally wasn't retrieved from the counter. It was only if we were investigating something we would get the file from the counter.
Yes, all right. And then further down, we can see that you're asking for development to look at this. And then if we go over the page, you say you haven't been able to reproduce it. The counter had a box swap an hour before the problem occurred, but I don't think that this is relevant. You've then said that you've got another report of the same problem elsewhere, and you give the FAD number for the branch. So please can this be looked at quickly? And you say, especially as if it is not reported before rollover, we have to get POCL authorisation for the fix. And so it is very visible. That means, does it, that if you had to fix it after rollover by inserting transactions, then it would be visible in some way?
I'm struggling to remember any details of this. I think if it was reported, but not until after the rollover, we possibly couldn't have fixed it at all. There would have been a receipts and payments mismatch, and then we would just have reported it to Post Office through the MSU BIMS route. But I can't be certain about this, having no memory of it, and I don't think I've seen this document until this moment.
The word there, visible. Visible to whom, do you think?
I don't know why I used that word. Yeah, visible to Post Office, I suppose, but as I say, I have no memory of this.
Or visible to the sub-postmaster?
I think the sub-postmaster knew about the problem already because they had reported the problem.
True, but you've identified that there's another problem elsewhere.
Yes, so that had been reported to us as well. So that was another postmaster who had noticed that it had happened. I mean, the summary is that they can't balance. I can't remember if it actually totally stopped the process because of this inconsistency, or if they could push on. I mean, obviously, postal orders and the fees associated with them should always be in step with each other. You shouldn't be able to have one without the other, and something had gone wrong here, and they were out of step.
A little further down, it says that there may be, the counter is at M1 and MR1, you may not be at M1R, you may not be able to recall what that means. But you do say, Les Ong says there are 2 fixes that I know of relating to postal orders that could have a bearing on this. And then if we go over the page, what we see when it comes back to you, and this is on the 10th of July, so it's a subsequent day, at 15:31, authorization for message store amendment now received from, and then we seem to get a email address, mick.theobald, and it's been edited out so we don't have the full email address. Is that a name that rings a bell?
I think he was a post office person, but I can't be 100% sure.
And following that, and a little further down, we see that applied fix to message store, and then there's the reference to the OCR again. And the balance snapshot now shows 19 POs and fees. Leaving call open until balancing stroke cash account done. So it looks as if it's been possible to apply this before rollover. And I suppose the the question that I'd like to ask is, how would it be possible to see on the ARQ data what had happened here?
Right, in the ARQ data, you would see when the initial problems were happening, the SAP, stock adjust positive and stock adjust negative lines that related to where they were trying to adjust their stock of postal orders, which they documented, and it was in there that the amounts got out of step, in that one, for the postal order itself, it was for a certain quantity, and for the fee, it was for a different quantity. So that's where the problem arose. And then in the ARQ data for the 11th of July, you would see the transaction also affecting the postal order, presumably affecting the postal order fees product, which I'm guessing now, but I imagine was another stock amount, a stock adjust transaction for the difference that was wrong. Whether there is anything on that individual message which in the ARQ data enables you to know that it was me who did it and not somebody at the branch, I do not now know, because I have got no record in this peak here of exactly what it was that I inserted. It's possible I used, as I said before, sometimes we used a dummy counter number. Sometimes we inserted a comment, but that's not necessarily going to be visible in the ARQ data as retrieved. Sometimes we used a username to try and make it obvious that it was SSC who had made the change, but it's not recorded on the peak here precisely what was done. Those messages would have been captured somewhere and recorded for posterity, but I don't know where.
The transactions would be asynchronous, would they, in the sense that the balancing transactions that you've inserted would show the date that you inserted them, not backdated?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. If I may just then briefly, the next one is a bit quicker. If we look at FUJ 0015 2240, we can see that this is summarised as cannot put transfer through, and this dates from 2004. The last entry that we can currently see says PM reports that he cannot put a transfer through. It keeps coming up with an error message. And if we then pick this up on page 2 at 12:30, so if we scroll down a little bit, this is where Barbara Longley has assigned it to you. And you've stated that the transfer causing the problem was started while the user was attached to the SUBDC. Can you just remind us SUBDC?
Stock unit called BDC, which was most likely Bureau de Change.
That certainly seems to be an issue with this one. There does seem to be problems with it being foreign transfer. And then you've said in the last paragraph of this entry, I've spoken to the PM and asked him not to balance stock units, BDC, MM or MC, until we've sorted out the problem. I'm loading up the message store on a test counter and hope that by amending the EPOS transfers object, it will then be possible to reverse the transfer. If we scroll down, Just on going over the page line, I've made a message store correction, and so you've then given an OCR reference, so it looks as if, again, we've got this process where you're formally seeking the approval to insert a transaction. Is that right?
That's what it looks like. Again, I've not seen this and I've got no recollection of it, but looks like it.
It says before and after messages attached. Is that a practice that rings a bell?
Well, we always yes, we'd always make a record of what we were changing or adding in. I don't know precisely now what they look like.
When you say attached, is that attached to the peak?
Yeah,
So the peak would have had the messages before and after the message you inserted attached to it. Is that right?
that's what it sounds like, yes.
You've then recorded, have spoken to PM and informed him he should be able to continue with the balance now.
Yes.
What you don't say is I've informed him I've inserted a transaction into your account, do you?
I don't explicitly say that, but I imagine I would have explained to him what I had done and that I had removed the transfer, which I mean, I'm not clear from this whether I wrote a pair of corrective messages that actually removed. How would it have done it? I'm not clear. Further up in the call, there was mention of an EPOS transfers object and suggesting that that needed to be rewritten in order to let this progress. So I don't know if that's what I actually did or whether I did insert a pair of opposite messages to undo the transfer that was outstanding. I certainly wouldn't have hidden from him the fact that I was changing something on his system which would remove this transfer that was preventing him from balancing his office and continuing to trade, to do his normal business.
Not hidden, but maybe not mentioned in the sense that it's not recorded.
It's not written down, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't have said it, because I usually did. I didn't make a secret of the fact that system problems happened, and I think it was I'm sure it was perfectly clear to him that there had been a system problem to do with a transfer, which and then once I had done whatever it was I did, the transfer that was stopping him had been removed in some way in order for him to progress. The fact I didn't write it down does not mean I said absolutely nothing to him. I certainly wouldn't have phoned him back and said, oh, look, it's miraculously all okay now, you don't need to bother anymore. I wouldn't have approached it in those terms, but I do not know precisely what I said to him.
Well, a system problem is one thing, but actually inserting transactions into the data that's stored on his counter is a different thing, isn't it? And if it's not written and recorded here, how would posterity ever know that you'd said that to him and told him that that was what you were doing?
If I'd known posterity was going to be asking, I would have written it down. But I don't know if there's any more information in the OCR. That certainly would make it clear exactly what it was that I did. Whether I explicitly said, I have removed the transfer, I have accessed your counter transactions and removed the one that was causing the problem, which is effectively what I'd done. I'm not sure it even needed saying. I would have thought he would have realised that that was what I had done, but I do not know what I said.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Is that it? Anyone else have any questions?
No, they don't, sir. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, thank you, Mrs. Chambers, for giving detailed answers to detailed questions over 2 days. As you know, you will be asked to return at some future date. I don't think we can yet tell you what that date is. If you haven't already received it, the probability is that you will get another Rule 9 request so that the general questions will be provided to you in advance. And although, in a sense, you're in the middle of giving your evidence, it's unreasonable for me to expect that you don't have access to your lawyers if you want to have access to your lawyers. So unless anybody immediately shouts out and says to me, you can't do that, I'm now going to tell you that if you want to speak to your lawyers, you can. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. For reasons that you know, we return on Tuesday next week, the 9th of May, to hear
Yes.
evidence from Barbara Longley at 10 a.m.
All right. Then the inquiry is adjourned until then. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, sir.